Joe Biden is attempting to rewrite history about his Iraq War yes vote and his talking up of the conflict in the years leading up to the invasion. Unfortunately, for him, there's something called video that exists. Tragic.
Some of my own party have said that it was a mistake to go to Iraq in the first place, and believe that it's not worth the cost, whatever benefit may flow from our engagement in Iraq. But the cost of not acting against Saddam, I think, would have been much greater. And so is the cost, and so will be the cost, of not finishing this job. The President of the United States is a bold leader, and he is popular. The stakes are high, and the need for leadership is great. I wish he'd use some of his stored-up popularity to make what I admit is not a very popular case. But I and many others will support him when he makes the case.
Yeah, that's not Biden talking about Obama in glowing terms. That's Biden talking about George W. Bush, who was an inept war criminal that started this whole mess. More on Biden's position on this in a second. But now that you've seen that, juxtapose that clear and obvious clip with failed presidential candidate John Kerry's defense of him. Kerry has endorsed Joe Biden.
I know very well what Joe's position was because I answered those questions back in 2002, 2003, and 4. And ultimately, we learned, as Joe did and I did, that the intelligence was distorted. So Joe spoke out and criticized. Joe was against what they were doing. The vote was not a vote specifically to go to war. It was a vote for the president to have leverage with respect to getting Saddam Hussein back to the negotiating table, back to the inspections, excuse me. And I think we were let down, and Joe has said many times that it was a mistake, obviously, to trust the words of the administration who didn't follow through on what they said they were going to do.
So that's just not the reality. Here is what actually happened. Mr. Biden, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, had been scrambling to draft a bipartisan resolution that would grant Mr. Bush the authority to use military force against Iraq, but was more restrictive than the war authorization that the president had sought. Mr. Biden's plan ultimately did not succeed, and he chose to focus on Mr. Bush's reassurances of a diplomacy-first approach. On October 11th, 2002, he was one of 77 senators to authorize the use of military force in Iraq. 23 colleagues, some of whom harbored grave doubts about the danger Iraq posed at the time, refused to back the president's request. So the best case scenario for Joe Biden is that he trusted George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, all of the insidious actors that we have come to know and not love so much. But the reality is that he wanted a bipartisan agreement to allow for military force against Iraq in the first place, which is a vote for war. Like, there's no splitting the baby here. And it's especially hard to explain away when you read how far back Biden was in favor of conflict with Iran, even before 2003. This is unearthed by the great Ryan Grimm, my colleague, Biden praising UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, who resigned because he wasn't getting support for an invasion to destroy Saddam Hussein's potential weapons stockpile back in 1998.
I think you and I believe, and many of us believe here, as long as Saddam's at the helm, there is no reasonable prospect you or any other inspector is ever going to be able to guarantee that we have rooted out, root and branch, the entirety of Saddam's program relative to weapons of mass destruction. And you and I both know, and all of us here really know, and it's the thing we have to face, that the only way we're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein is we're going to end up having to start it alone, and it's going to require guys like you in uniform to be back on foot in the desert taking taking Saddam down. You know it, and I know it.
So he's advocating for regime change there, which, with boots on the ground, saying that U.S. troops have to be back in the desert. And also at this point, he's repeating the notion that Saddam Hussein has WMDs when his entire defense has been, and I think Kerry repeated it there, that it was all the fault of the Bush administration for misleading him into that assumption by providing faulty intelligence. There's no getting around it. I mean, it would just be easier if he owned it and said, I made a mistake. But that's not really in Biden's nature. And he does have that kind of Trumpian quality, which I've continued to point out before, that he just is very arrogant. You can see it in that clip, just strong in his convictions, even when his convictions are dead wrong. And we're seeing more and more of that, even when you go back as far many decades ago. That's just who he is.